YouTube channel. So great.
Yep.
Wow. Awesome. Well, hello everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue. Welcome. Ani Boujou, Guinowea. I'm so happy to be here with you on this day. This is our fourth and I think last speaker of our seminar series for fall 2023. Welcome to those of you who are new joining us for the first time. My name is Dr. Tina Semeniuk, and I am the director of FishCAST. If you're unsure of what FishCAST is, it's an NSERC Create training program where the whole mission is to try to train the next generation of Canadian scientists in freshwater conservation and management. For those of you who've been with us before, welcome back. I am talking to you and speaking to you from Wawaitanong, which means where the river bends in Anishinaabe-Moan. It's also known as Windsor. And FishCAST is primarily administered from the University of Windsor, which sits on the traditional lands of the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. I've said this before, but I want to say it again with every single time we meet and get together, that the values of FishCAST really do try to represent the fact that we do value reciprocal relationships with Indigenous peoples, knowledge holders, local knowledge holders, as well as place our water and our land, and that the journey that we're all on is definitely not linear, but it's circular as we learn together, as some of us unlearn, and as we work together collectively to try to decolonize the disciplines that we work in, to try to create the capacity to overcome the systemic barriers that we face, and to find like-minded people with similar values to be able to work collectively and collaboratively to overcome them. We've had a great seminar series this fall. We've gotten a really good look behind the curtains and seeing how different levels of government function, what it took to get to the position, people's own personal journeys along the way, whether or not it's from provincial governments to federal governments to conservation authorities. And it was just been, I think, inspirational to see people's journeys and the welcomes and the words of wisdom coming from our collaborators in FishCAST partners. And I'm delighted to be able to pass this off to Andrew, one of our FishCAST trainees, to present to you and introduce to you our last seminar series speakers, Dr. Len Hunt. And without further ado, Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I welcome you all. Take care. Miigwech. Merci.
Thanks, Tina, and hi, everybody. Hi, Len. I did my FishCAST internship with Len. That was a couple summers ago now. That was the first of a couple internships. It was a great experience. I got to work on and look at some of the data from our national survey of wreck fishing in Canada, and learned a lot and did some other work on survey and other sampling methods in the human dimensions of fisheries. Len's a great speaker to have here with us today for a number of reasons. Among those reasons is that Len really has his thumb on both pulses, the external academic science side of things and the internal, more applied science management side of things. Currently, Len's a senior research scientist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, studying the human dimensions of fish and wildlife conservation and management. For over 20 years, Len's been leading the Human Dimensions of Conservation and Ecosystem Management research program in Thunder Bay. His expertise is in the human dimensions of fish and wildlife, and in particular, modeling the behavior of outdoor recreationists like anglers and hunters. Among other things, these models help estimate the benefits that these recreationists accrue, along with the impacts on the environment and other people. Len's communicated this science a number of places in a number of ways. Len spoke to Senate staff in Washington, D.C., I'm aware, about climate change impacts on North American recreational fisheries back in 2016, and similar work has continued since then. Len holds a PhD in Geography and Environmental Sciences from Wilfrid Laurier University, along with a second graduate degree in Geography and undergraduate degrees in Geography and Economics. On a personal note, Len has 2 daughters, and with his leisure time, he likes to fish in the summer and in the winter, curl and fish. So with that, I'll hand things over to you, Len. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks everyone for taking time out of your busy day to talk about something that seems rather strange. I have this title in front of you here. This is actually a title of a book chapter. And on behalf of a number of co-authors, I'm going to present some of the materials from that book chapter. And it's part of this book on understanding recreational fishers, disciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches for fisheries management, which will be coming out in 2024. So take a look for that one when it appears. Before I start delving into the aspects of that particular chapter, though, I thought we would have a little bit more of a conversational tone, and we would discuss things like what is legitimate knowledge and who decides what is legitimate. So that's where I want to really spend a few moments trying to discuss at this point. If we were actually in a person setting, I think it would be even better because I could ask a number of uncomfortable questions where everyone could just look down at the table and make sure they don't make eye contact. So you're off the hook here. You don't have to worry about that. But I imagine most of the people here come from a natural science background or in a natural science program. So, a very simple but uncomfortable question for individuals is, what is science? Like, what is it? Like, how would you explain it to someone, right? So you can think about that for a second or two. The answer that I'm using here comes from Tom Nuds, who's a professor emeritus at University of Guelph, and he sort of described science as a structured process to develop knowledge. It's a bit of a cop-out because, like, well, what do you mean by structured process? But I think it's important to really emphasize this point that science is a process, and that process really is around knowledge generation, okay? And so another uncomfortable question would be, well, what are the philosophical foundations of science? Like, what's it built upon? How does it arise? Well, number one, and you can probably tell a bit of my vintage from this as well, that there's a single truth out there. So there's a single reality, okay? So that's one belief behind science. A second is that if only we spend enough effort and use appropriate methods, we can uncover that truth. And that's really the foundation of science. But of course, when I start saying appropriate methods, your mind might go, well, what do you mean by appropriate methods? And yeah, let's talk a little bit about what are appropriate methods behind a science-based process. So you can think of hypothesis testing, this deductive approach. It's empirical, it's quantitative, it's focused on experimentation, treatments, controls, enough replicates to be able to say something meaningful, reliable, valid. All those things are packed under the appropriate methods from a science-based process. So what happens if you use inappropriate methods? Well, if I send in a manuscript for review to a journal and I don't follow the right recipe book here in terms of the methods that I use with the science-based process, my manuscript will be summarily rejected. If you're a graduate student and you hand in your thesis or dissertation and it's deemed to have inappropriate methods, well, that's not good either, right? So we have a number of people who are evaluating whether we have legitimate knowledge or not defined from that science-based process. And I'm going to come back to this point a little bit later because it's a really important one to stress. But before we get there, I'm just going to flip us completely into a new perspective, which is other ways to develop knowledge. So I'm going to put out a little scenario for you. So think about, a game that you like playing or you played in the past. And if you've never played a game, well, hopefully you find one in the future. But just think about one of these games in general. And so the question for you is, how did you learn to play that game? So did you use a science-based process? Did you develop a number of hypotheses, test the effectiveness of different tactics at different times with all sorts of replicates out there to provide reliable and valid information? I doubt it. I don't even think it's possible. So you used a non-science-based process to generate that knowledge. You probably learned through trial and error, mimicking other people, talking to other people, and maybe seeking external information elsewhere. So we have knowledge that's being generated outside of that science-based process. Is that knowledge legitimate? Yeah, it's legitimate. It's a legitimate way to develop that knowledge. So it's outside that science-based process. And another question, which is kind of interesting, is would your knowledge differ if you actually learn from different people? And it's like, yeah, it probably would be different if you learn from other people, which means maybe there's not a single truth out there. Maybe there are multiple realities, multiple truths that constitute valid knowledge around playing these games. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the content from the book, and I'm going to start off with some research paradigms. So these are academic research paradigms around knowledge generation. There are other ways to generate knowledge: indigenous knowledge, local knowledge. It starts moving us into a realm of co-production. I'm just going to limit the conversation here, though, to these academic concepts. So if you think of something like science, with its roots in positivism, it has that sort of one reality independent of human thought, where you have these objective empirical research where we can ultimately obtain the truth if we do things correctly, and we have hypothesis testing and experimentation. And there's some weird labels attached to these items. Ontology, the theory of being. And there are different ontologies out there. So if you look at positivism and critical realism, they both share that same ontology. But when you move to social constructivism, it's like, hey, there's not one single reality. There's multiple realities, and they're created by your interactions. Just like that game. If you were to talk to other people, you would have a different reality about what is a way to play that game. And then epistemology, which is basically theory of how you develop legitimate knowledge. So if you come from a positivist paradigm, you have this objective approach. But if you move over to critical realism, it's the world's too complex. It's context dependent. And you have to situate yourself within that context to make any type of sense in terms of knowledge. And then with social constructivism, since there are multiple realities, well, you better go and talk to people and have that back and forth to try to understand what those different realities are for individuals. And those lead to different types of methods over there. So that's sort of a foundation that leads us to another discussion, which is really the idea of disciplines. So I'm not going to talk about subdisciplines and fields and subfields or anything like that, but just ultimately, what is a discipline like science? And I really like this definition from Schumer. And it's that a discipline is a body of knowledge and a social body that generates, evaluates, communicates, and teaches the corresponding knowledge. And you'll notice I bolded the word evaluate. There are referees out there. There are external examiners out there. There are individuals put in place to ensure that the knowledge that's being generated and taught is legitimate. And that legitimacy is based on that epistemological belief. This is the way that we generate legitimate knowledge in a science-based discipline, for example. The evaluators, on the one side, it's important to have them because you want to have structure, you want to have consistency in terms of what is legitimate knowledge, but it's also a form of control. So depending on your perspective. And I think even more important than that, that it's easy to carry forward this evaluation of work within your discipline and apply it to work from other disciplines. And you end up with the potential for disciplinary arrogance, where it's that I don't like the way that you generated your knowledge, therefore it's not legitimate. And this really causes problems when you try to work with people outside of your disciplinary perspective. Okay. So one of the things I've been studying over time is really the idea of understanding recreational fishers. And there are a number of disciplines and fields that have been applied in an academic setting to try to make this understanding better. And it goes way back to the 1920s under ecological science, where the work was really around using people as informants for the resource. Creel surveys, which sometimes are called surrogate biology. So you go and talk to anglers out in the field to find out, hey, what are the impacts associated with fishing in terms of harvest? The labels that I have here below the fields, so the citations, those are all chapters within the book that's coming out. And from that humble beginning of trying to understand how anglers impact the resource, we start to move to resource economics, where it's a recognition that people benefit from using the resource. And how do we articulate those benefits? Or in social psychology, why do people do what they do, and how do they benefit from that use? Or even more recently with political ecology and environmental history, where it's like anglers are one group within a series of groups that all have relationships under, say, a recreational fishery. And it's the study of those relationships and power imbalances that is really key and important. So what we've tried to do is we've taken these 7 different fields and we've tried to categorize them on the grounds of their purpose, whether they focus on relationships, the behaviors of the individuals, or outcomes more generally, and as well the research paradigm. And it really actually starts to pull out some pairings in terms of the way that different fields are related to each other. So starting from the right to the left, we can see that both ecological sciences and resource economics have a strong pairing. They both have a strong tradition out of positivism, and they both focus on outcomes. Ecological scientists obviously are interested in impacts on ecosystems. Economists are interested in trying to understand benefits to people. If we move to the middle ground, you'll see behavioral economics and social psychology. They have grown out of a tradition of more critical realism, and they're really trying to understand the behaviors of recreational fishers, why they do what they do. And then finally, we have environmental history and political ecology. And they start to infuse some elements of constructivism in terms of the research, and they're really focused on those relationships. So those pairings help us to understand complementarity and substitutability between disciplines that are studying recreational fishing. And I'm just gonna, these are quite detailed slides. I'm not gonna spend my time going over all of the details. Just the lay of the land. Anything in black is sort of common between the pairing. Anything in brown is something that differs between the pairing, so the brown colored text. The only couple things that I'm going to highlight here are the assumed human behavior. So both ecological science and resource economics has this sort of rational actor view. So rational actor is somebody who has perfect information, makes perfect choices, knows everything they need to do. It's a model of convenience. And ecological science has provided a lot of benefits in terms of understanding recreational fishers. Some of those key contributions. I'll just point out the second one, the predator-prey relationship. So one of the ways that you can characterize recreational fishers within a fishery is that they are predators in a predator-prey system. And it works pretty well, other than most people's viability is not dependent upon the availability of recreational fish, right? For the resource economics, obviously there's a strong tradition in terms of non-market valuation, and there have been different ways to try to characterize and understand people's behaviors so that you can come up with these values through so-called choice models, these behavioral models, which had their beginnings from the transportation economics literature in the 1970s with Daniel McFadden. And as well, some of the work with stated preference methods, or in other words, we can ask people about what they intend to do, or in hypothetical settings, what they might do. And that comes really from early marketing work with Jordan Louvier in the early 1980s. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here talking about all these details. The one thing I will point out here is that historical ecology is really cool. If you've never heard of it, look it up. It's a way of going over past documents, whether they're photographs or landings data or anything else, and you can start to understand what the resource used to look like in the past. And it's a way to help us get over what Daniel Pauly describes the shifting baseline syndrome, right? Is that researchers and managers today might consider consider resources to be of a reasonable quality because they never experienced or are aware of the abundance that was there that preceded them. So by looking back over time, we get a better idea of changing environmental conditions. So it is something that I think it's worthwhile having a look at. Another pairing here is social psychology and behavioral economics. Again, they're focused on those behaviors of individuals. You can see that we start moving away from this rational actors to some acknowledgement that maybe people aren't optimizers. Maybe they don't always make the right decisions in all contexts, and we should account for that. The difference really between behavioral economics and social psychology is in terms of behavioral economists really focus on quantitative methods and experimentation. Social psychologists use a variety of approaches to try to understand people's behaviors. So social psychology has taught us about why people fish and what they get out of fishing in terms of their satisfaction. Cognitions, how values and value orientations shape attitudes, how norms about ways other people think we should behave influence our ultimate behaviors, and in terms of the heterogeneity that exists among recreational fishers, with Hobson Bryan's seminal work in the 1970s around the concept of recreation specialization. For the behavioral economics, the behavioral beliefs contribution, that again is sort of that same foundation that norms are important in terms of influencing people's behaviors. Cognitive biases, Thaler and Sunstein, you may have heard of nudges, how different choice architecture can ultimately affect behaviors of individuals. That's what cognitive biases are all focused on. So if you offer people an opt-in or an opt-out, you get a different response, right? So if people have to opt out of something, they tend to stick with what was originally offered. If they have to opt in, they don't opt in. The one that I'll really quickly highlight is the behavioral preference side. So this comes from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky from the 1970s in what is known as prospect theory. And it's really the idea that people view losses and gains quite differently in terms of how they contribute or detract from their well-being. And to give you sort of an example here, let's say we were going to play a game. Let's say I was going to get you to flip a coin into the air, and if it lands on tails, I'll pay you $100. Now, if the coin lands on heads, you're going to pay me. So the question is, how much would you be willing to pay to play that game? So economic theory tells us it should be $100. That's the equivalence point. No one is going to select that. So what Amos and what Kahneman and Tversky basically showed is that people are loss averse. They don't like losing. And it's probably about a twofold difference. So you're probably only willing to pay up about $50 to play that game on average. So it's just one of the ways that people may not operate in what we consider to be optimal behavior. And the final one is really political ecology versus environmental history. Again, focus on relationships, lots of work around understanding power dynamics within these systems. So really lots of interesting ways to go about understanding recreational fishers and recreational fisheries. And what I'm going to do now is shift to the third part of the talk, which is really this idea of interdisciplinarity. One of the questions for you is, what is the difference between multi and interdisciplinary research? And I really like the definition of these terms from Van den Besselaar and Heimerix, which is in a proceedings paper, but it's absolutely a great description that they provide. So I've just taken out the elements to show it in a table here. So they both would take this approach from multiple disciplines, but the difference really is in the level of integration and in terms of co-creation of theory. So for me, multidisciplinary, you have a team of disciplinary experts. They go on their own, they do their thing, they show up at the end of the project with their little subpart of the report already printed out, and the integration occurs when the project PI staples all those pieces together. That's about the extent of it. Whereas with interdisciplinary research, the integration is throughout. You learn from each other and you benefit from each other's understanding and experiences. So one of the things that's necessary for interdisciplinary research is sort of a common conceptual model to help guide the research. And in recreational fishing or fisheries, social ecological system is sort of a logical place to situate interdisciplinary research. And there's a lot of details here. I'm not going to go over them all. There's a social system or human system, which has a lot of complexities within itself. And there's an ecological system here, the aquatic ecosystem, which has a lot of complexity in itself. The real point here is that from that social system, some of our people engage in the activity of recreational fishing. And from that engagement in recreational fishing, they generate services, whether it's food production or whether it's recreational and leisure-based services. And that's the connection in the system. But the recreational fishers also can impact things like fish stocks, which can then alter the services that are delivered, which can then alter future behaviors. And that's sort of how that wheel works in terms of this interdisciplinary perspective, that it's important to understand the recreational fisher, but as well how that fisher is situated within that ecological system. So how do you go about conducting interdisciplinary research? So I've got 6 different bullets here. I'm just going to highlight 2 of them. The first we've already talked about, these epistemological differences. It's important to get over that disciplinary arrogance. It's like, I don't understand what these people are doing. They're going out and talking to like 8 people and conducting interviews, and they think that's legitimate knowledge. You got to get it out of your head. It is a different way to look at the world, okay? It doesn't mean that it's not rigorous. It doesn't mean that it's not valid. It means that it's not science-based or traditional economics-based information. The nomenclature confusion is an important one as well. Every discipline has its own jargon, and it takes a while to sort of sort through that. But it can get really complicated when people use different concepts for the same basic idea. So, for example, social psychologists have come up with this term, place attachment. And place attachment really defines the fact that people keep going back to the same place for, say, a recreational activity like fishing. And it could be because of place dependence. It's a real good place to go fishing. I catch a lot of fish. So that kind of makes sense. But there's also a place identity component. And that identity is basically like, this place is significant to me. I have a history with it. It brings me all sorts of other intangible benefits that can't be easily understood. Well, economists have this term called state dependence. And state dependence, in sort of a more spurious way, is just misspecification error in a model. It's that people keep picking the same choice, the same place, over and over again, just because we didn't figure out that there are really important things about that place that are observable, like better catching of fish at that location, that we just didn't put in the model correctly. So that's almost like place dependence. But they also have this substantive state dependence, which means that people keep making those same choices and there's something else to it. That's the place identity concept. Different terms that basically mean the same thing. And the other issue with nomenclature is that sometimes the same concept is understood differently. So talk to an economist about value and talk to a social psychologist about value. You'll get a different perspective in terms of what those terms mean. So it makes it challenging to talk to each other. All right. So what I want to finish off with is just sort of an idea of how you might sketch an interdisciplinary study on recreational fisheries between recreational fishers and the aquatic ecosystem in this case. So here's sort of a simple conceptualization where I've tried to embed aspects of resource economics and ecological science. So ecological science provides a good understanding of the aquatic ecosystem and the impacts to that ecosystem. The resource economic side helps us to understand the anglers or recreational fishers. So our recreational fishers or anglers come from society, a subgroup. They have different expectations and preferences for their experiences, like going out to a fishing site. Based on what's available, they make a choice. That choice results in outcomes like harvesting fish, which can impact the aquatic ecosystem. But those outcomes can also be information. I learn a bit about whether this is a good place to fish or not. That updates my expectations, which reshapes my behavior. This is sort of the classic approach to an interdisciplinary study of recreational fisheries. It's between resource economists and ecological scientists. Why? Because they share a similar research paradigm, right? They tend to focus on that positivist view of the world. They accept each other. It's like, I like the way you generate knowledge. I can understand it. So that's the common way that we see interdisciplinary research. But it's not the only way. We could add in information from social psychology. So you can see all these arrows coming from the anglers to the expectations and preferences and choice and outcomes. That's an acknowledgement that there's heterogeneity among anglers. There are different types of anglers, and maybe they differ on the grounds of specialization. So specialization is basically how connected they are to the activity, how skilled they are at the activity, and how avid they are in terms of their behavior with the activity. So this is another way that we could start to build a more interdisciplinary study of recreational fishers by adding in social psychology into the mix. We could also add behavioral economics to the mix by looking at the way society develops norms about recreational fishing, which can influence anglers' expectations, and that over the long term, that when you experience, say, depressed fishing quality or enhanced fishing quality, that can influence your preferences overall. There's a reason why people who live where I do tend to prefer walleye, while those in the Southeast US prefer smallmouth bass, while those out in British Columbia prefer salmonids. It's because of the availability and those expectations that shape the preferences. And then finally, we can start to add in elements from political ecology in terms of management. And in terms of management, can have actions on the system like stocking and rehabilitation or regulations, which can affect people, their expectations and outcomes in the aquatic ecosystem. But that there's also relationships between anglers and managers, between society, non-anglers and managers. And those can help to shape the types of policies and expectations moving forward. So, at the end of the day, what did I try to communicate to you? Well, one, hopefully you have a better understanding that what is legitimate knowledge is really a normative question, right? It's in the eye of the beholder, and it depends on your disciplinary perspective. And you should try to take those blinders off. Try not to be arrogant in terms of your understanding of what's legitimate and not. That there are many different disciplinary perspectives. A whole other avenue would be discussing co-production. So maybe the joint production of knowledge through Indigenous peoples and a natural science background, two-eyed seeing, for example. But even that has its own limitations because there are all sorts of other academic research paradigms beyond positivism that can generate knowledge. So sometimes those get pushed to the side. So we should not forget about those other perspectives. And then finally, we should encourage interdisciplinary research where possible. We do realize that sometimes disciplinary approaches are best. It's a simple question. Like, we don't need to involve people from 12 different disciplines to answer the question. But I think overall, being committed to understanding different perspectives, learning about those, can be very rewarding. And then the finally, I just have a couple reference slides here. So I'll go through those. And there's my contact information if anyone has any questions that we don't get to today or wants to follow up in the future. By all means, go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Len. Nice. We're going to open up the floor to questions. You feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat. And I thought as we wait,